Hello, and welcome to another episode of Promote the Hell Out of It. My name is Misael Trujillo, and this is the podcast where I talk to people worth promoting about subjects we should all be talking about, we should all understand, and I am so incredibly happy to share today's episode with you all. I had the absolute privilege of chatting to Hope Virgo, author, public speaker, and multi-award winning campaigner. Hope actually suffered with anorexia for over 4 years before being admitted to a mental health hospital in 2007, where she lived for a year, obviously fighting one of the hardest battles of her life. But since being discharged, she's done some incredible work. She's the author of the book Stand Tall Little Girl, and she uses her public speaking as a way of sharing her experiences with mental health illness to champion the rights of others and inspire them to get well. She's also working on an incredible campaign called Dump the Scales, a petition calling on the government to enforce guidance for eating disorder treatment. All the links to her website, to the campaign, to everything I could find that we talked about is in the description to the podcast episode below, so please do check that out. We cover a lot of ground on the episode, everything from travel tips to Christmas tips to how we as friends and family can be of greater support, to tips with people who are suffering themselves, how schools can be looking at the subject and how they can be of help, as well as a lot of other things. It's really an episode that I think could help a lot of people. I really hope you enjoy it, and I really hope that you can share it about, because I hope that it can reach as many people as possible. This episode is sponsored by our friends over at Nextstand. The link to them is below too, and as listeners of the podcast, you get a cheeky 10% discount. Their products have really helped me with my posture, with working on a computer all the time. They do incredible laptop stands that fit easily into a backpack, so great for me as a remote worker constantly traveling around. But yeah, check them out. They are absolutely awesome and they really help us out. So without any further ado, here is my episode with the wonderful Hope Virgo. Hope, thank you so much for being on the show. How are you?
Yeah, really good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing very well, and I am really excited to chat because I think that the conversation and the topics we're touching on are so important.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm really excited to be talking to you as well.
I think a good place to start is with your story, if that's okay, so that listeners can get an idea of where everything starts.
Yeah, no, perfect. So I developed anorexia when I was about 13 years old. Looking back, I now know that was when it started, but when I was kind of living with it and when I first got unwell, I had no idea there was anything the matter with me. And I pretty much hid it from everyone around me for about 4 years. So lied an awful lot, rebelled quite a lot. And as soon as anyone tried to interfere with anything, I got quite dismissive and normally shut people down quite quickly. During that whole 4-year period, I didn't realise, like I said, there was anything the matter with me. To me, the anorexia was like having this best friend in my head, kind of giving me this reassurance, telling me what I should be doing, and making me just feel really good about everything. It basically just took me away from the reality of growing up. And I loved that. I loved those feelings that it gave me and the fact that it switched off all of those negative emotions that I might have been feeling. And yeah, really did give me some kind of purpose every day to kind of get up in the morning and to keep going. I think then throughout that 4-year period, I didn't realise how dangerous what I was doing was, and so kind of just kept doing what I was doing, and like I said, kind of rebelled quite a bit so that people wouldn't interfere with me. And then eventually when I was 16, my school intervened and I went to my GP, and then I finally got referred to the Children's Adolescent Mental Health Services. And actually in itself, that was really terrifying. I think when you're an adult, but when you're a young person, kind of probably even more so, and you go to a mental health kind of hospital, you have no idea what to expect. And I remember my first day when I went for an appointment to kind of get an assessment done, and I just had no idea what to expect. I was kind of sitting in this waiting room just looking around at all these other people, like absolutely terrified that someone was gonna like shout at me or someone was gonna start to maybe interfere with me. And then I went into my appointment and just had to fill so many questionnaires about my body image, about my relationship with food, my relationship with others. And I found it really difficult because I'd never once thought about my emotions, and I was having to kind of judge myself on a scale of 1 to 10. And then in my second appointment, I did finally get diagnosed with anorexia, but was still in that complete denial phase. Went to CAMS as an outpatient for the next 6 months. And despite kind of convincing myself that I was totally okay, at this point in my life, I was really, really struggling, and I felt really isolated and really alone a lot of the time. I didn't know who to talk to about how I was feeling. And instead of trying to talk in my therapy sessions, I just sat there kind of like this adolescent teenager, pretending like everything was fine, because I didn't want to start. I think I was scared about opening up like a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people will be able to relate to in many types of therapy, that feeling that way.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Because I think sometimes you don't know how much... I think my thing was you don't know how much information to tell people because you're too scared about people interfering with your life. And so you don't want to give away too much. Yeah. But then you need to give away enough to get that support.
Yes, exactly. And
then eventually I then did go to hospital full time. So got admitted 6 months after I'd started at CAMS because I was very unwell at this point. And again, I think that throughout the whole issue around the denial about being unwell, not really kind of agreeing with the process and trying to basically find a way to recover when you're still in that denial phase.
Yeah, of course. And there's so many points that I'd love to expand on the story. So maybe starting from the start almost, the age when you're talking about from 14, that's a very young age for anyone to understand what they're going through in those terms. And I'd love to touch on the statistics of how many young people are going through similar experiences, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. So across the whole of the UK, there's 1.6 million people diagnosed with an eating disorder. They haven't broken it down into children and adults, but I think the majority of those will be young people, so people who are kind of 10 up to 18. And there were some stats that came out last week that said actually the number of people getting diagnosed with anorexia is currently double what it was even just kind of 4 or 5 years ago. But the issue with diagnosis, and when you look at the stats, is it doesn't count all of those people who haven't had that proper diagnosis, people who are functioning with an eating disorder, and even people who have eating disorders that don't kind of fit nicely into the kind of main 3 categories, which are anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder.
And what kind of support networks are there at schools, for example, for people with eating disorders at the moment?
Very, very few. So it completely depends on the school mainly. So some schools do have school counsellors. But the majority of the work that I do in schools, when you go into the schools, there isn't really any kind of concrete support, and a lot of it will be down to the teachers, kind of working out what support they can offer those young people. And quite often with eating disorders, people do maybe end up in hospital or end up getting kind of more intense support as a way to help manage them in their recovery. But I think it's really difficult because when you are in schools and you have a young person who's not eating maybe, or eating too much, or eating and then purging, it makes it very difficult for the teacher to know how to fix that situation, but also difficult for all of their friends around them as well, because it adds that kind of pressure onto the young people too.
Of course. And is there anything or any tips that you'd have for schools, like easy things they could do in terms of changing the language they use or the culture around lunchtimes, anything like that would help?
So I think there should be more education done in schools around mental health problems, but specifically on eating disorders. So I do a huge amount of work in schools, but quite often some schools are quite nervous about getting someone in who's had an eating disorder because they're scared about triggering people. But I think we need to make sure that we're having more of this open conversation and educating people at all levels about what an eating disorder is and how to support people. I think quite often when it comes to schools and it's like a lunchtime environment, it's around making sure the conversation's okay. So not talking about dieting, not talking about calories, and making sure that actually people know that they can eat in everything in moderation. And it's about pushing that healthy messaging around food and exercise and lifestyle. I think where schools do occasionally kind of, I guess, maybe do more damage than good is when they become so fixated on calories and telling people that if they eat a certain amount of calories, they then have to do a certain amount of exercise. And that then creates a very unhealthy messaging for young people.
It's really interesting. Yeah, when I was at school, there was a huge changeover from vending machines with chocolates and soda pops everywhere to Jamie Oliver taking it all down almost within a week, it seemed, when you were a kid. Do you think things like that have actually affected it for a positive or for a negative?
I think up to a point it's been a positive, but I think sometimes we go too far with that messaging and we scare young people into not being able to eat certain foods, and we create this whole fear factor around food, and instead we should just be educating them. I think quite often we are tackling an obesity crisis, but we often forget actually about the mental health of other people too, and the messaging that we're putting out there, particularly places like Public Health England, who launched 2 years ago an 100-calorie snack campaign, whereby young people were encouraged to only have 100 calories in the morning as their snack. And again, it's that kind of messaging that can be really detrimental for a young person, even for an adult, particularly when you're a young person and you're much more easily influenced by things. So I think it should be looking at actually the whole picture. And when you are working in schools and doing things like what Jamie Oliver did with taking everything away, it's about educating people around why he did that, and then explaining about things like moderation as well.
And I think talking about subjects that have kind of a negative connotation, something that I think society's placed a lot of negative thoughts on is the idea of therapy. And when I've had therapy for mental health before, I had similar experiences to what you mentioned and found it a very difficult process and quite a difficult process internally to go through, as you mentioned as well. So I'd love to touch on how important you think therapy still is regardless of that, and what could be changed to make it easier for people.
So I do still have therapy, and have been having therapy again for the last 3 months. And I think that, like you said, there is so much stigma when it comes to therapy. And I think as well, people quite often have quite bad experiences of therapy, and we don't talk about that enough. We kind of just pretend that all therapy's normal, and it's not normal, but normal, it's fine and everything's going to be perfect in that session. But I think we don't talk about the realities that yes, you will have some therapists that you gel with and some therapists that you don't gel with, and it's important to find that right person. So I think quite often when it comes to us talking about therapy, we need to take a bit more ownership about actually finding the person that works for us, but then also being okay to go and have those sessions and to talk about things, and to then also take the time to do the follow-up stuff afterwards. I do also think that when it comes to therapy, there are so many different kinds of therapy out there that sometimes we just have to do research and find the therapy that really, really works for us. And that's okay, that might take a little bit of time.
It's not something people generally talk about, is it? You get generally two types of people that like therapy or dislike it. And you don't generally get encouraged to find something that works specifically for you. You don't get reminded that not all of it has to be okay or feel okay for you personally.
No, exactly. And I think that's what's really difficult is we don't talk about it enough, and then when we do, it's always quite negative, or we just think that people are going for it because they're strange or they're weird or they're relapsing or whatever it is. Whereas I think actually a lot of people in society would benefit from having therapy sessions, because it is that time to offload and kind of give yourself some headspace.
And what about the current political climate and how it's affecting the budget and underfunding of the NHS and so many different things? How is that jeopardizing the help that people need in terms of mental health and eating disorders?
Massively. So I've got a campaign called Dump the Scales, which I launched last year. And the reason I launched the campaign is that a lot of people with eating disorders, they go and try and access support for services, but because they're not underweight, they can't actually get any of that support. And because of the political growth, political turmoil and everything like that, it means that campaigns like this have just been put on hold while they work out what they're going to be supporting and what they're going to do. But actually the fact is that the mental health crisis is not going anywhere, and it needs to remain on the government's agenda, but actually remain as something that we don't just talk about, but actually we see that real concrete action about. I think it's so upsetting nowadays, the amount of people that we see just turned away from services because they haven't hit that crisis point. And we should be focusing more on things like prevention and early intervention to make sure that people get that support before their kind of health completely escalates out of control.
Of course. And I want to start on the Dump the Scales campaign. How can people get involved, and what can we do to really push it along?
So at the moment, I'm nearly on 100,000 signatures. So it would be amazing if people could sign it and share it across their networks. At the moment, it's kind of like we've made so much progress before, like Boris Johnson came as Prime Minister, and then with the general election now coming up, it's kind of that fear that all of that progress that we made could be lost. So at the moment, it is about getting as many signatures as possible. It's about sharing more and more stories. And I'm gathering a lot of case studies at the moment so that actually when we get to that 100,000, we can do a real push to actually show the government that this is a real issue.
And obviously the link for that will be in the description for the show notes as well. And we will push it out across all our social networks too. The other point I wanted to touch on was something that you also talked about on Good Morning Britain, and I watched that, and there was a really good quote you made, which is that you can't wait for someone to get to crisis point before intervening, and you just said something similar in your last comment, and I'd really love to expand on that because I think it's a really crucial point.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we do talk about, but we still haven't seen that real action done. I think what's really scary when it comes to mental health services is that there is just no equality with physical health services. And if you went to the doctor with a physical problem, whether you'd broken your leg or you'd cut your hand open or whatever it is, you would get seen immediately. Whereas with mental health, you don't get that. And I think that's what makes it really scary, is you're told to go away until you are much worse. And it means that there are so many people who are just struggling, feeling isolated, feeling guilty, and particularly with eating disorders. So with anorexia particularly, it's a very competitive illness. And it means that when you're turned away from services, that whole competitive nature kicks in even more so. So you then go away, you try and lose all of that weight, you become fixated on it. And this is why actually we're seeing this increase in people in hospitals as inpatients who get stuck in this cycle of just being in and out of hospital because they haven't ever been able to get that intervention before it's too late.
Yeah, of course. And can I ask, is that problem exacerbated in Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, for example?
I think that is something that definitely adds to it. I think quite often we don't tailor services to what people's cultural backgrounds are or what people's needs are. And I wonder whether that's partly a cultural thing and that maybe some other cultures find it harder to talk about things. But I do think, again, it's something that we're just not exploring. I recently did some work actually looking into this and realising, particularly working in some schools where they have a huge kind of diverse group of young people in those schools. And actually a lot of people from BAME communities don't feel like they can actually reach out for support for an eating disorder because it goes completely against their cultural expectations. And it means that these young people are, like I said, just kind of suffering and struggling on their own. And I think services need to be able to adapt what they're offering so that we can make sure that people are getting the right support.
Of course. And what about the actual recovery time? Because I think it's very easy for people who aren't themselves in these situations to view this as something that you get help for and is then fixed. What is the reality of recovering from something like that?
It completely depends on the individual, to be honest. So for me, my recovery took a year of inpatient treatment in hospital, and then it's something that I manage now. So I think some people don't fully recover. You just learn to manage that. But also recovery means something different for different people. And I think as individuals, we need to find what our recovery looks like and what we want that to be. And then throughout your recovery, you start to challenge yourself and you push yourself a little bit further. But I think it's a hard one, and I think the research and the science proves that if you intervene earlier, then you're more likely to get someone who's got a prolonged recovery, and you're going to get a quicker recovery time. But I think on average it will be a couple of years, definitely.
And what about friends and family during that recovery time? What are the tips you'd give them on how they can be supporting their loved ones?
So the main things I think are around kind of being there for that individual and making sure that they know that you're going to be there for them no matter what. I think quite often when you've got someone who's got mental health issues and you're supporting them, it can be emotionally and physically completely exhausting at times. There will be a lot of arguments, there'll be a lot of kind of dysfunctional aspects of it, and quite often you might feel like it's completely your fault and that you can't fix that person. But it's about being there for that person, offering that support. Every now and again, I think having those direct conversations around it. when it's an eating disorder, it's important to actually work out actually how you can support that individual at meal times. So whether it's sitting down with them and having the meal with them, or whether it's reminding them throughout the meal they might be struggling, or sitting down and actually looking at the whole week and actually working out when they want to have stuff and what they want to have, and how you can make sure that's kind of as stress-free as possible. But also remembering that the lack of eating, or eating too much, or eating and purging is all a symptom of actually something else that is going on. So it's so important that throughout recovery, we don't just look at individuals and see that mental illness, but actually we see so much more of that person, and that we remember that there is so much more to that person.
Absolutely. And I'm guessing that a time like Christmas, which is coming up, makes all that more difficult for someone, for the family as a whole, but for the person specifically. Are there any specific tips you'd recommend people try for this kind of period in the year?
So I think it's firstly really important to remember that just because Christmas is a day that there tends to be more food available, and food kind of lying around, it's about reminding yourself that firstly, you don't have to have any more food than you want to have on that day than's kind of within your meal plan. But actually remembering that just because there is a day where you're going to eat a little bit more, it's not an excuse to then not eat in the run up to Christmas. I think as individuals who are supporting someone, it's about making sure there's a plan in place for the day. So making sure there's timings of things, making sure maybe there's backup food available in case that person's worrying, and actually work with the individual who's in recovery to work out what works for them. I also think it's important to have bits of space, so making sure that actually people are able to get space on the day if they need it, taking off that pressure that actually we have to have this perfect, amazing day. And as soon as we start removing that pressure, it makes it so much easier for everyone, actually, not just the person in recovery, but everyone around as well. And also just making sure that there is kind of those distraction kind of aspects available on the day too. So say like you have a lunch, and then the person who's struggling with the food might be looking visibly distressed or a bit upset, or might be feeling a bit guilty. It's about maybe organising kind of like a board game, or watching a movie all together, or going for a walk or something. So you've got that distraction to help keep them going as well on the day.
I think those tips are incredible and really, really useful. And whilst we're on the subject of these kind of tips, something that we talk a lot about on the show, because myself and Jane did it, is traveling. We did 9 months traveling around Asia. Obviously, for anyone who's in recovery or anything like that, I mean, guessing is incredibly challenging. And I know that you've done some travel videos and talked on the subject. Is there anything that's helped you deal with that situation whilst you've been traveling?
Yeah, I have done a lot of travelling actually. So straight after uni, I went and lived in Asia for a year, and then did a lot of travelling around Southeast Asia, and then also have done...
Amazing.
Yeah, I loved it. Then done a kind of most of Europe, and then the whole of the Middle East as well. And I'm actually going to Japan on Saturday.
Incredible. So jealous.
I'm literally so excited. But I think the thing for me, so travelling was a massive part of my recovery. So when I was in hospital, it was one of my motivations to actually get well, was that I really wanted to see the world and I wanted to explore. And I didn't want to let my eating disorder kind of stop me doing that. And so what I tend to do when I go away, whether it's for kind of like a couple of days or for a prolonged period of time, is I always make sure in that time that I have at least 2 meals that I already know about in advance. So meals that I find maybe a bit more easy, and maybe I've done a little bit of research into restaurants that I might want to go to. I also make sure that I have a day that's just completely easy if I need it. So maybe having making packed lunches and a packed dinner that day if I need to, just to make sure that I haven't got that kind of added pressure on myself. And then I think as well, just having someone that I trust and I feel accountable to. So having someone that I can check in with, just to make sure that I'm having enough food or I'm not having too much, and having kind of someone that I can be really honest with. I think, again, like, we worry so much when we go on holiday because it's kind of completely out of our routine and it's slightly different. But what I always think is actually, when I look back over my kind of memories of holidays and traveling and things, like I have had moments where I've worried a bit about the food, but actually being somewhere new really, really helps me to feel a bit more relaxed and adjust to that situation. And I think quite often it is about kind of being strong as an individual and reminding ourselves that actually in 6 years' time, we're not going to look back at a photo of us eating a meal or look back at somewhere we went on holiday or traveling or whatever, and be worrying about how many calories we'd had that day. So it's about sometimes just trying to be really strong and saying, I'm going away for 2-3 weeks, let's just try and be okay for this. And then when I come back, I can focus a little bit more on having easier foods if I need to.
And is there a country that you've traveled that you found the easiest in terms of food, and maybe one that you found the hardest?
So I think 2 easy ones was probably Thailand. Mainly I think because I lived there for 9 months, so I got used to all the food there. And then the other countries, kind of group of countries, is places like Jordan, Palestine and Israel, just because I find Middle East food, I really like Middle Eastern food, and I find that a bit more, kind of a bit easier to manage. I think the hardest place I've been to food-wise is probably Sri Lanka. I think I struggled quite a bit there with the curries and the kind of food they have. And I found a way around it in that I ate a lot of fish when I was there. And I always make sure that I'm eating, even if I'm finding it difficult, because I think that's really, really important in recovery, to kind of stay on track with things. Because as soon as we start restricting, there's then that fear that it might come back. But in those situations, I just have to keep talking about things and share my worries and my concerns with people. And I think that's a big thing for me, actually. As long as we're honest with people, it makes it so much easier to manage the food.
I always recommend Thailand as a good place to start if people are heading to Southeast Asia, because it's a good country to get used to the changeover, especially like the shopping centres and things in Bangkok can make it pretty easy if you're having an off day and just need some cool air conditioning and easy food.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Something that I think is incredibly important in any kind of recovery is taking time for yourself. Do you do any type of yoga or meditation or anything like that that's helped you?
So I'm not very good at taking care of myself, in all honesty. So I'm a bit of a workaholic, and I think I care so much about the work that I do find it quite hard to switch off. So my kind of time for myself tends to be, I try and go on holiday every kind of 2-3 months for either kind of like a long weekend or a prolonged kind of week or so. So that's my time. I also do a lot of running, and actually when I'm running, it gives me the headspace to really think about things and to start to process ththings as well. So I think those are my 2 main activities that I probably do to get that kind of, that self-care element back, which, yeah, it's not something that I do every day. And I think for me, it's about actually working out how I can build things like that into my routine more. I did try and do yoga once, but I kind of struggled with it, to be honest.
No, I can relate. I've been trying to get into yoga recently. I did a great episode with Nikki McGlynn about neurodevelopment. And obviously running falls into that too, because it's just the movement that helps the brain heal so much in so many different kinds of ways. But it's a great episode. I'd really recommend checking it out because it's got some really useful information in it. But I think that one of the things we talked about there was that everyone needs to find a way of doing it themselves. I can relate to what you said. I find it very difficult to find time to meditate or do yoga daily. So finding something that builds into your personal routine and feeling happy with that, I think is a big part of that recovery, because you can't be punishing yourself for not having time to do yoga daily.
No, I completely agree. And I think it is, finding something that does work for you and also realising that you can also do stuff for yourself that doesn't have to be really expensive. I think quite often when we think of kind of self-care and doing stuff for ourselves, it's like getting your nails done or having a bath. But actually it could just be sitting on the sofa and reading a book for an hour. So it doesn't have to be something really intense.
That's so true. And what about body image in terms of during recovery? Because I've got a lot of friends who suffer from body dysmorphia, and I know how difficult it can be for them. What's helped you deal with that aspect of things?
So I think it's something that I still have to manage. So my body image is something that occasionally kind of flares up a bit, but the ways that I manage it when it does that is, so I always tell someone. So normally text my mum or my sister or something and say I'm having a really bad day, feeling really fat today. I then also try and break down what the feeling fat means. So I think quite often we say the word fat and it has it's been created in society as a really negative word, and it shouldn't be that negative. And quite often when I say I feel fat or I feel really horrible or ugly, it normally means that something else isn't going quite right. So I might feel out of control or a failure or really upset about something. Because I'm struggling to say how I feel, I automatically go to that feeling fat word. So actually quite often it's about identifying what my feelings are. And I do think for a lot of us it is about actually working that out and kind of trying to relate our bad days and link them back to our body image days. Because I guarantee if you start doing it, you'll see that kind of interlinking within that. And then the final thing that I do is I remind myself that what I see in the mirror isn't the reality, and actually just kind of say that to myself a couple of times, and it helps me to kind of get on with my day. And then normally within a few hours I do begin to feel a little bit better about things.
You mentioned that the first thing you do is message someone or tell someone. What is the best thing they can reply with or say back to you in that situation?
So my mum normally says something like, stay strong, stick together. But I think sometimes it's just about reminding someone that it's going to be okay. And the more sometimes we don't feel like it's going to be okay, but having someone say that with conviction, it really, really helps me. And also kind of sometimes people remind me of how far I've come so far, and reminding me that actually I don't ever want to go back to that place, and that the feeling that I'm feeling at the moment will eventually pass. So it's about sticking with it and just staying strong and trying to keep fighting it.
And I know that it was something that you're doing, which is incredibly inspiring to me personally, is all the work you're doing in this field is incredibly inspiring. But for me, seeing you do a lot of public speaking on the subject is incredible, because I don't think it's ever easy to talk about our own personal experiences and share them with everyone. So why do you do it? Why has it been so important to you?
So when I came through my relapse a couple of years ago, I realised that there are so many people who are struggling, who just aren't getting the right support they need. But there are also other people who are struggling, who don't know how to talk about things, and who just feel completely isolated. And I wanted to share an accurate depiction of actually what recovery is, and that yes, it's really hard, but it's also totally worth it. And to also help kind of challenge that stigma, that we do still face so much stigma around mental health, and it's something that people don't fully understand, people don't know how to recover. And I wanted to basically get my story out there, so just try and kind of add to that conversation to make this real long-term positive change happen across the world. And I think for me, that's something that does keep me going, like meeting people every day and talking to them and hearing other people's stories actually reminds me why I do what I do, to help all those other people who might be struggling.
That's amazing, honestly, Hope, and I'm so glad you are, because it helps so many people, and it's so important to talk about these subjects. And I find it so strange that we come out of education not knowing half the things that are important to how we treat others and to situations that come up in our own lives sometimes.
No, exactly. And I think sometimes it is so important when you've been through a negative experience to try and find a positive in it when you're ready. And actually turning negative experiences into a positive can be so beneficial, not just for everyone else, but actually for also as you as an individual.
Of course. I want to touch on something you mentioned, which is relapsing, and I think that can be something that obviously is very scary to anyone going through recovery. But I also think that it is something that needs to be destigmatized, and that people need to know how to help others with. What would you say should be the view on relapsing, and how can other people be a bigger support network in those situations?
So when you relapse, I think firstly, one of the reasons it's so difficult is because you feel guilty yourself for the fact you've relapsed. So I remember when I relapsed, I felt like I'd let everyone down around me. I'd let kind of friends and family down, but also let the hospital down that I'd spent a year of my life in. And I had all this added pressure, kind of feeling weak, feeling guilty, and not knowing who to talk to, because I didn't want to open up about it because I was just really scared and embarrassed. And I think the fact is that a lot of people do relapse, and it's about managing it when you do, so that you don't completely escalate out of control. Something that I do have is a relapse prevention plan, and it's basically kind of a list of things that are things that if I start to do these things, whether it's kind of restricting a bit or exercising too much, or my mood drops for maybe more than 5 days in a row, that's a red flag. And I think having plans like this in place is really, really important, because it helps us to spot those signs quickly before things escalate out of control. And I think when you have those plans, it is about, actually, I have one and my mum has the same one as me, so that we can both start to spot these signs and actually see that it is an issue again, and then you start to have a conversation around it. I do think the thing with relapsing as well is that you've built that trust, kind of gained that trust back from people around you, and then that trust kind of in effect is kind of broken and damaged quite a bit. So if you're someone who's supporting someone else who's going through a relapse, or at that kind of stage where they might be starting to relapse, it's about having that direct conversation, reminding them that you're there for them, but then actually assessing what support they need and reminding them that yes, you do trust them, but you want to be able to help them get back on track. And I think the more we talk about things openly like that, the better it will be for everyone who actually needs that support.
And what about the opposite side to that? Whilst you're in recovery, what are the things that really make you full of joy and remind you that you're doing the right thing and this is why you want to be doing it?
I think just meeting the people that I meet, actually. So kind of seeing the impact that some of the stuff that I'm doing has on people, but also particularly with things like my campaign, actually realising that this is a massive issue that needs to be solved. And I think sometimes for me as well, it's about reminding myself how far I've come and realising that I never want to go back to that place again. And that's why I have to stay kind of focused on what I'm doing and keep moving myself further and further forward. But it's not always easy. And I think quite often when I talk about it, I paint, like today I probably painted quite an easy picture of it. But there are some days when it's really, really difficult still. And it's on those days, it's then how you manage that, how you keep going on those days. And remembering that actually, however you're feeling, like however awful you're feeling one day, actually the next day everything might be okay again.
Of course, and I think it's very easy to talk about these subjects, especially with someone like yourself who's a public speaker. You're used to talking about it and you're experienced, and as you said, get the idea that it's easy. But obviously you've got the experience because it hasn't been easy, otherwise you wouldn't be able to talk about it the way you do. And also I know that you've got so many projects on that I can only start to imagine how busy you are, because we've talked about your public speaking and everything else you do, but we haven't even mentioned the book yet. And that must have been a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it was quite intense. I loved writing the book though. And I found it extremely therapeutic to write actually as well. And I think for me, a big thing around the book was making my story really accessible to everyone, so that actually wherever you're at in your recovery, whether you've got an eating disorder or another mental health problem, or whether you're a parent or a carer or a friend, it can be accessible to every single person who might need that support.
And when did you decide to write the book?
So I wrote little bits and pieces when I was in hospital, but that was mainly just for me. So probably about 4 years ago, I decided that I really wanted to write a book and to get my story out there to help other people. And kind of since then, it's just been kind of, something that I've been doing. And I do a lot of writing in my spare time, so a lot of blogging for various websites. And I think, again, it's just a way to make sure that your message is getting out there, and that there's a message out there that can just work for so many different kinds of people with that practical support and advice, but whilst having that kind of honest aspect to it, of the fact that I really understand what people are going through.
Of course. And what about the reception you've got? What's it like putting something like that out into the world and then hearing from people that you've never met before, for example?
It's quite overwhelming at times. So I have had some very bad trolling online over the last year, not about my book, but kind of just generally about the work that I do. And I find that quite difficult to cope with sometimes, so I find it quite upsetting. But I'm definitely getting better at dealing with that sort of stuff. But with regards to the book, most of the kind of feedback I've had has been really, really positive. And I think it reminds me why I do what I do, but also kind of motivates me to actually keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think that I can relate to what you've mentioned. I sometimes avoid putting some of my personal experiences on the internet because there's that kind of dark side to the web. where unfortunately some people have nothing better to do than apparently ruin other people's day and say stupid stuff. But obviously the good you do outweighs that so much. One person's just wasted their time, the other person's got encouraged or found something that can really help them. And I think that's what really shines through from everything that you've been doing.
Yeah, and that's the thing that you always have to hang on to, I think, is the kind of the positive impact that you're having.
Any final tips that you think people should leave this conversation with? And I want that on two sides. First of all, on the side of your personal experience of anyone going through something similar, but also what the loved ones should take away that we can really do to help.
So for people who are struggling with an eating disorder or other mental health issues, I think the main thing I want people to take away is that it's really important to talk about how we feel. And I know that sounds really basic, but actually the more we talk about things, the better it is. And I used to be someone who never talked about anything, who never felt able to share my feelings or emotions. But actually, as soon as I started doing it, it just got so much better and life just felt so much more manageable. So I would encourage you, if you are struggling, to actually start trying to talk about things and to realise that talking about it does really, really help. And then if you're supporting someone who's struggling with their mental health, I think a big thing that I would suggest is to create some happy memories with them. So to actually go out and do some nice stuff with them, to look beyond their mental illness. And yes, talk to them about how you can support them, have those conversations. But at the same time, by creating happy memories and doing fun stuff together, actually that individual will help get their love of life back, and that will help them in the long term in their recovery.
That's such a beautiful takeaway from the conversation. I will mention obviously the Dump the Scales campaign again so that everyone can go sign that, and the link will be below. Is there any other projects or upcoming things you've got going on that you would like people to know about?
I don't think so. I think, the main one is the campaign, and then my book, of course, as well, if anyone wants to see any more information about me. That's
the link will be underneath to all of that, of course. And thank you so much, Hope. I have really, really enjoyed our conversation, and I think it's going to be really useful for people.
Fab, thank you very much.
Chat soon.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you so much for checking out that episode of the podcast. I really do hope you enjoyed it, because I had such a wonderful time chatting to Hope, and I think it's an episode that really has the potential of helping a lot of people. So please do share it about. Let me know what you think, if there's anything I should have asked, or what's been the most helpful piece of advice you've received from the podcast so far. It doesn't have to be this episode, any in general. All that feedback really helps me make a better podcast for all of you. We do have some wonderful guests lined up for future episodes. That being said, I'm always interested in hearing who you would like on the show. So get in touch. That is incredibly helpful. All the links for everything that was discussed on today's episode is below, as well as the links to our sponsors Nextstand, who are absolutely wonderful. So check all that out. Leave us a review if you get the chance. That is always helpful. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, I would recommend checking out the one with Nikki McGlynn. What is neurodevelopment therapy and how could it help you? We mentioned it on the podcast. It's absolutely wonderful. Another great podcast episode that you might enjoy is the one with Dr. Stephanie Strafty. The Perfect Predator, How Do You Fight a Superbug? Super interesting podcast episode. I really enjoyed it. But yeah, there's a bunch that you can check out. Just go through. If you're a first-time listener, I hope that there's a bunch of episodes that you find really helpful, encouraging, or just interesting to listen to. Without anything else to say, because I am just rambling now, I will catch you next time.